In this video, I'm going to teach you how to make a battle-ready Dark Angel Space Marine in less than 20 minutes using a mixture of contrast paints and regular acrylic paints. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to lay down a prime undercoat on the miniature. And I really like using my black primer. You'll see almost anything I paint, I use a simple black primer. Now, you can use Chaos Black from Games Workshop. However, I find that the black ultra flat Krylon paint works really well. It does go on a little bit wet compared to Chaos Black from Games Workshop, and that means you really do have to let it dry. It will almost look like you've overpainted it, but as it dries, a lot of the liquid evaporates, and it actually leaves a really thin coat that looks really great. Once you've done the basic black prime, then after that, you do need to start thinking about what we call the zenithal highlight. And what this does is it allows us to have the black shadows underneath to stay on the model, while the grey sear paint is creating a highlight above it. And this is actually duplicating sunlight. You know, typically sunlight is above our heads, so it's lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. And this is going to be really important to give us a nice pre-shade, so that when we add the contrast paints, it's going to really add some depth to that model and look a lot more interesting, rather than if we just painted the entire thing in the grey sear primer. So as you can see here, we've got our miniature that's been primed, and you can see the dark shading sort of like underneath in the lower part of the legs and under the gun and the shoulder pads, and yet the rest of the model's still quite bright on top. This is going to allow us to have that really nice shading that we're looking for when we add the contrast paint, and I'm going to be using the Dark Angel contrast paint to apply the color to the model. Now, I'm actually going to use this straight from the pot because contrast paints really have been designed to be used in that way. You really can put them on with one thick coat, and the people that I've seen using it wrong, the thing they get wrong is they apply a thin coat, but you actually want to use thickness. I found just doing one big thick coat really does work exactly as Games Workshop said it would, but most people are over brushing it in my opinion. You can see here when I put it on the backpack, rather than continuing to brush, I'm going to add more paint, and I'll continually apply more paint to the model to make it so that I'm not overspreading it. You'll also notice that on the shoulder pads, I brush in the same direction each time, so there's no conflicting brush strokes. Just in case it does leave any streaks, it will look like part of the design. So I find that brushing downwards on that makes it look better. And as you can see, there's no technique really needed in this. You're just making sure that you're applying the paint thick and over the entire model. And so as you can see, in no time at all, the miniature is completely done, and then you'll just leave that there to dry. Once you've got your fully dry contrast painted Dark Angel, it's time to go back and start thinking about where we're going to have color. Now, the first thing we need to do is to touch up all the areas where we got contrast paint on the gun, because of course we don't want the gun to have any of that Dark Angel color showing through, as we're going to paint it a completely different color. You'll see that I'm not really using a very small brush for this, and that's because I actually find a thicker brush works quite well in supporting the tip. I really like the thicker brushes that Games Workshop sells that are sort of like short and stubby. I find that the brush is a little bit easier to control. I use a mixture of contrast paints and regular acrylic paints depending on what I'm painting, and it's all about how many layers I'm going to put on. If I need to paint something in more than 2 layers, then I'm probably going to use the regular acrylic style because you get a little bit more control and it tends to look a bit better. But if the contrast paint is going to allow me to do it in just 2 quick layers, then I'm usually going to just use the primer and then a contrast paint to get the effect that I want. So after I've got that primer down, I've got to wait for it to dry before I add a contrast paint. So I'm going to start using this Retributor Gold to pick out the emblem. So this is really just about fine brush strokes, just being a bit careful, trying to make sure that I don't go back over that gun or on any of the green. And you can see here I got a little bit of gold on the shoulder pad just there, and I try to brush it off with my finger. Sometimes that's a trick that works, sometimes it doesn't. So what I'll do is I'll instantly try and brush it off if I can, and if I don't get away with it, then I just know it's something I need to touch up a little bit later on. Or of course, if I'm going to paint the edge of the shoulder pad a different color, then it doesn't really matter. So next I'm getting this Mephiston red, which I'm using as a base color, and I'm going to go around and do the edges of the shoulder pads. The reason that I'm using this rather than a contrast paint is because I really want to have some control over where it goes and get like a fine line. If I were to use a contrast paint, I'd have to use the grey sear first and then the contrast paint, and I'd run the risk of the contrast bleeding into the green, and then it might give me an untidy edge. I've seen a lot of different people do this, and in fact Games Workshop's tutorials show to do this area with the contrast paint, and I think it just makes much more sense to use a regular acrylic. They're a little bit more dry and you've got a little bit more control over them. And again, I'm just going to go around all the edges of this here on both sides to get it looking good. Now that the grey sear has dried up on the bolt gun, I'm going to take the Contrast Blood Angels red and I'm going to apply it all over the areas of the bolt gun that I want to be red. I've been playing Warhammer for almost 30 years now, and so I remember Games Workshop's red phase where all bolt guns were red, and I kind of can't get it out of my head. In my head, bolt guns have to be red. And so what I'm doing is going through all the key panels here and just adding that Contrast Blood Angels red to the area. And this is great because it's going to give me a highlight, a shadow, and of course the core color all in a single coat. So all I had to do was touch up the primer, and then it's really easy to just add this on. And so now I've done the red and let it dry just for a little bit, I can grab this basilicanum gray, and I'm going to add all the metal colors in this gray. So I'm going through the barrel and the back of the gun and the magazine, and of course the sight here, and I'm just adding this basilicanum gray, and I find this makes a really nice metal color if you edge highlight with a metallic color afterwards. I'm about to show you what that looks like in a moment once this dries. So now I'm using an Evil Sun's layer paint on the shoulder pads to add a little bit more color to the highlighted areas. Now, what's cool about this is like the old style of layer painting. I'm not trying to paint over everything I painted with the Mephiston red as the base coat. I'm just thinking, where would the light be hitting it, and just adding this color to those areas. This is just going to make it brighten up in the areas that would be brighter due to sunlight hitting them or what have you, and it just makes it stand out a little bit more and looking good. And now I'm going to add the Reikland Flesh Shade to the Retributor Gold from earlier, just to add some shadows and some definition in there. Once again, this is just going to add some shadows into that gold and make it look a little bit more rich. Next, I'm adding snakebite leather to all of the pouches. What I love about snakebite leather is it really does create an organic color. It pools in such a beautiful way that makes it look organic. You really don't have to be too careful with this color. Remember that you're not trying to have a perfect image, you're just trying to make it look like leather, and so it's absolutely fine for it to be discolored in areas. Next, I'm taking the Black Templar contrast paint, and I'm just finishing up the pistol. So I'm doing the handle and the barrel at the bottom of the gun. You'll notice that I just put the black straight over the contrast brown snakebite leather, and that works absolutely well because the black's such a strong dark color that, that it can go over the other colors, and it just darkens them up a bit. So now I'm going to do the eyes of the model, and I'm actually going to use the gray sear again. I'm using a very small brush now, and I'm just going to create almost like tiny little lines or ovals inside the Dark Angel's eyes here. I'm trying to be careful not to go over the lines. And I find that the grey sear works absolutely great for the eye technique that I use. You could use white here if you didn't want to, but I've already got grey sear on the palette, so why not use it? So now I'm going to use a Liberator Gold to start picking out the highlights on the gold areas that I painted earlier. The Reikland wash has dried into the shadows, and so I'm trying very hard not to just paint over the whole thing. I just want to pick out the edges and the raised areas. Areas where light would naturally catch and make it look really bright. And you'll see that I'll move the model around to give me the easiest access. And, I'm just trying to pick out the tips of the wings and the highlights. Now that grey sear is probably dried because it was a very small amount of paint, I'm going to use one of my favorite eye techniques, which is actually just to grab a shade. In this case, I'm using Cassandra Yellow, and I'm just going to drip a drop in there into each eye. And you can see it's almost like too much there, but that's not a problem because I can take off the excess with another brush until I reduce it down again. And the Cassandra Yellow is going to struggle to take over the green anyway, and I can brush it off before it dries. Now, this is one of my favorite things to do with these battle-ready Marines, and that's to look at where the contrast paint has created natural highlights and then pick them up even more using the highlight or edge highlight you typically use for this model. So I'm using Niblet Green in this case, and I think this is really what helps my miniatures pop. I'm not doing every single edge, I'm just picking out some of the edges. So it's almost like I'm adding a highlight to the natural highlight in the contrast miniature. This really only takes a moment, but it looks incredibly polished, and it adds this depth to the model that you typically only see in sort of like most people's pro painted. But it's cool because I'm getting the guidance on exactly where to add the Niblet Green highlight based on the contrast paint. So I don't have to spend too much time on this, and I'm really just thinking, what are the easiest areas? And I like Niblet Green because it's a dry paint, so you've got very minimal chance of it spilling out anywhere and ruining the rest of the model. And then finally, I'm just picking out some of these other details that I missed, like the purity seal on the leg. Again, this can be done with a contrast paint really easily, so I'm adding some grey sear on it first of all to function as the base for the parchment. And then I'm going to take some Mephiston red to be the core part of the purity seal. Now I'm going to, while the grey sear is drying on the purity seal, I'm going to get some of this Necron compound. And you can see that sometimes you have to reactivate it. Necron compound gets a bit weird, the dry paint. So I'll mix some water into it and mash it into my wet palette until it gets to the consistency that I like. And then I'm going to use that metallic paint as a highlight. And essentially I'm just going to run lines straight down the sort of like the barrel areas and then pick out the edges. And what's cool about this is it adds a really nice metallic sheen against that basilicanum grey, but it makes the whole thing stand out and look really nice. And you're just trying to pick out the raised areas here to make the whole thing just look like it's metal. And it really does make it shine and get a really nice effect. Like I said, it's like a cross between non-metallic metal and metallic metal. It ends up looking really good. And then I'm going to go back to that purity seal there, and this is a skeleton horde, which I find makes a really nice parchment over the grey sear. And it's cool, you just put it on in one coat and it looks like a piece of old parchment. Very easy to do. the benefit of these contrast paints. And there you have it, the finished battle-ready Dark Angel Space Marine. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. If you've enjoyed watching it, please let me know what you think. Give me some comments, critiques, and feedback in the comments below. Let me know if you have any further questions, and thanks ever so much for watching.